Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 27th election in Canadian history happened on the 25th of June 1968, where the Liberals had nominated the incumbent Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Wait a second, I watched the last video. It said Pearson won. What happened to him? Well, in April of 1968, Pearson retired from politics and effectively resigned the prime ministership, handing it over to his cabinet member, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And, he was pretty popular. He's been the leader since the 6th of April 1968, and his leader seat is in Mount Royal. Robert Stanfield is running from the Progressive Conservative Party, and he's been leader since the 9th of September 1967, and he's running from Halifax. The Social Credit Party, which for some reason has not gone away, is nominating A.B. Patterson, who's been the leader since the 9th of March 1967, and I'm really happy that it isn't frickin' Robert Thompson. And he's running from Fraser Valley, and he also ran in Fraser Valley East, but he did lose that one. The New Democratic Party, or the NDP, is sticking with Tommy Douglas, who's been leader since the 3rd of August 1961, and he's running in Burnaby Coquitlam, and he also ran in Burnaby Seymour, but he did lose that one. And the Social Credit Party, but a name in French, that's what I like to call it anyways, Réellement Crediste Party, Réal Couette, who's been the leader since the 1st of September 1963, and he's running in Témiscamingue. I probably said that horribly wrong, but it's worth a shot. This may sound crazy, but it's true when I say that Pearson's government was actually collapsing. In February 1968, the government nearly fell before this election could even take place when it was unexpectedly defeated on a tax bill. Pearson didn't want to resign until the next Liberal leader was chosen, but it was very easy to see that the Liberals couldn't really even think about holding on until the next election, so they had to call this election as soon as they possibly could. One day later, yikes, the party might have actually collapsed. Oh, but 8 years before this election, there was a first debate in American history in the 1960 election, at least televised, between the Democratic Party's nominee of John F. Kennedy and the Republican Party's nominee of Richard Nixon. Now we have a first ever leaders debate in Canadian history, which took place on the 9th of June 1968. It included the Liberals, Pierre Trudeau, the Conservatives, Robert Stanfield, the NDP's Stephen Douglas, and the Réal Crediste Party's Réal Couette, not having the Social Credit Party, which actually led to its demise. Oh crap, did I say that? Couette and Trudeau spoke French, but Trudeau also spoke English in the debate. A.B. Peterson, the leader of the Social Credit Party, was not even invited to the debate, so yikes, that sucks. Also, 3 days before, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, was assassinated, and the stilted format was generally seen as boring and inconclusive. I think I've said all I needed to say, so let's get into the results now. There were 264 seats in the House of Commons and 133 needed for a majority, and according to the 75.7% of people who turned out to vote, the winner would get 3,686,801 votes, only good enough for 45.37% of the popular vote, but good enough for a majority of 154 seats. The winner would be the very popular Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who would remain as Prime Minister. A.B. Peterson not being invited to the debate fricked up him, his whole campaign, and his party, because the Social Credit Party went from having around 3-4% of the popular vote to having 0.85%, with a total of 0 seats won. This would be the worst the Social Credit Party ever performed, and actually, he was so bad, the Social Credit Party essentially collapsed. Not entirely, but essentially. And I'll see you guys for the election of 1972. The Zod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 28th election in Canadian history happened on the 30th of October 1972, where there were four major party candidates. Réal Coët of the Social Credit Party, no longer that old knockoff party. Interesting how that goes, who's been the leader since the 9th of October 1971. So basically, I'm thinking about posting a video about this actually, of how the Réal Coët became the leader of the Social Credit Party from being that knockoff party earlier. It's actually really interesting how that happened, and he's running from the same seat he ran in 1968 in, Témiscamingue. Okay, please, someone help me out on that, please. David Lewis of the New Democratic Party since the 24th of April 1971, who's running in York South. He became the leader in the 1971 NDP convention when Tommy Douglas, there's only two ways that he could become the leader, and it's the less harmful for Tommy Douglas, and that would be through resignation. The Progressive Conservatives are going to stick with Robert Stanfield, who's been the leader since Diefenbaker stepped down on the 9th of September 1967, who's running from Halifax. And of course, the incumbent Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, of the Liberal Party, who's been the leader since the 6th of April 1968, when former Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson resigned, and he is running from Mount Royal. This election was kind of an anomaly, because Pierre Trudeau's Liberals used to have a 10-point lead thanks to the spirit of Trudeau mania, but by 1972 it had worn off, and the Liberals tried to deflect any controversy about the slumping economy and rising unemployment hurting the Liberal Party. Stanfield and the Tories tried to capitalize on the public's perception that the Liberals were mismanaging the economy by saying with the slogan, "A progressive conservative government will do better." Not the best slogan, right? The Liberals had even worse. They campaigned on the slogan, "The land is strong." And the television ads were all about illustrating Canada's scenery. The slogan really fastly became derided, and the party had developed real issues to campaign on. It's kind of a big deal, the economy and unemployment, Trudeau. You probably want to fix that. The party platforms, the biggest thing that the Liberals were campaigning on was trying to reduce abuse of unemployment insurance. The Progressive Conservative Party's biggest thing that they were campaigning on was index tax brackets to inflation so that taxes do not rise as the cost of living rises, which I think is a very interesting thing. The New Democratic Party was campaigning on eliminating 3% increase in personal income tax rates scheduled for the 1st of January 1978 and reduce rates by 8% for ordinary Canadians. And the Social Credit Party was campaigning on increasing old age security payments to $200 per month beginning at age 60 and to $150 per month for the spouses of seniors regardless of age. So like seniors 60, let's say the senior's 60 years old, you're 61, your wife is 42, they get $150 in their pension. The Social Credit Party is trying to incorporate that. I don't know, that's up to you guys to decide if that's good or not. With nearly every poll favoring them to lose, Pierre Elliott Trudeau wasn't really feeling well going into the 1972 election. And with 76.7% of people turning up to vote, Trudeau felt screwed. Did he win though? The winner of this election would have 109 seats won out of a needed 133 to get a majority. So yeah, they kind of didn't do too well. They got 3,717,804 votes, which accounts for 38.42% of the popular vote. That would be the Liberal Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who, by some luck of the draw, managed to win another election. Stanfield got 107 seats, just 2 seats less than Pierre Elliott Trudeau, making it, to this day, the closest election in Canadian history. Oh yeah, I know I'm a little late when I say this, but that picture I showed earlier that you probably really didn't care about, the hockey one, that was in the 1972 Hockey World Champions or whatever it's called, and Canada beat the Soviet Union. Usually I don't really care because it's hockey, but it actually matters a lot because of the Cold War. Tensions with the Soviet Union were rising after this because the Soviets are a bunch of... And I'll see you guys for the election of 1974. Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 30th election in Canadian history happened on the 8th of July, 1974, where the incumbent Liberals stick with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who has been the leader of this party since the 6th of April, 1968, and he's of course running from Mount Royal. The Progressive Conservatives didn't have time to have another nominating convention, so they of course had to stick with Robert Stanfield, who has been the leader since the 9th of September 1967, and he's running in Halifax. The New Democratic Party, or the NDP, also hasn't had another chance to make another nominating convention, so they had to stick with David Lewis, who's running from York South and has been the leader since the 24th of April 1971. The Social Credit Party is going to stick with Royal Coet, who's been the leader since the 9th of October 1971, who's running from Témiscamingue. If you watched my election of 1972, you'd know that Trudeau only won the election by 2 seats. So maybe they couldn't get anything done, but they were able to get stuff done with the support of the New Democratic Party, who in May 1974 backed out of this agreement and voted with the Progressive Conservative Party to bring down Trudeau's government in protest of a budget which was proposed by Trudeau's finance minister, John Turner. The opposition parties didn't feel that this bill went far enough to control the spiraling inflation. Speaking of, the issue of inflation would be key in this election campaign. Stanfield had promised a 90-day wage and a price freeze to break the momentum of inflation. Trudeau had ridiculed this policy as an intrusion of the rights of businesses and employees to set or negotiate their own prices and wages with this very catchy catchphrase, "Zap, you're frozen." And with really nothing else going on about this election, I think it's time that we talk about the results. With 71.0% turnout, which is 5.7% less than the last election, the winner of this election would get 141 seats thanks to 4,102,853 votes, which is 43.15% of the popular vote. And that would be Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who got 141 seats, which is greater than 133, which is needed for a majority in the House of Commons, thanks to 264 seats being there. Robert Stanfield got second, and thanks to this election, he would step down in just 2 years after losing 3 consecutive elections to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. This came as a shock to many people because most of the polls actually predicted Stanfield to have at least a minority government. And the fact that the margin of error for Stanfield was this big, again, Trudeau won 141 seats, Stanfield won 95, shocked the hell out of anyone, especially considering last time it was a gap of just 2 seats. Now the gap is a lot of seats, so this actually surprised a lot of people. David Lewis and the New Democratic Party, well, David Lewis had to step down. You want to know why? He lost half of the seats. They went from 31 seats to 16. That's not really good, and it was the worst performance that the NDP had ever had up to that point. And the Social Credit Party got 11 seats, which is not even enough to be required to be recognized as a party in the House of Commons and therefore qualify for research funds and parliamentary committee memberships, which is freaking funny because this party should have died a long time ago. And I'll see you guys for the election of 1979. Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 31st Canadian election took place on the 22nd of May, 1979. Canada had been going through what's called stagflation, where inflation and unemployment had been rising, and the national debt nearly doubled under Pierre Elliott Trudeau's 5-year third term. So the progressive Conservatives are obviously not going to like Trudeau, who in 1976 had their leader Robert Stanfield resign. And on the 22nd of February of that year, they held a convention where they nominated 39-year-old Joe Clark. The New Democratic Party had David Lewis been forced to resign, so they brought in the third place candidate of the previous NDP election, and that was Ed Broadbent. The Social Credit Party had been struggling to remain relevant after their leader Rael Coet died in 1976. They then nominated his son Gilles Coet, who was only there until someone else could be there. And in 1979, on the 30th of March, they nominated Fabien Roy. And of course, the Liberals are going to be sticking with the incumbent Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who's been the leader of that party since Lester B. Pearson resigned on the 6th of April, 1968. When Joe Clark took a tour to the Middle East to discuss foreign affairs issues, his luggage was lost, and to this day I'm pretty sure it's still lost. And Clark appeared to be uncomfortable when answering questions about issues that were being discussed. The Liberals also tried to pinpoint this, and also his youth, by making leadership and Clark's inexperience the main issue in the election, which of course Joe Clark really couldn't combat other than the stagflation. This election also was the first one where the Parti Québécois was in. What is the Parti Québécois? Basically the modern-day predecessor to the Bloc Québécois. It was a Quebec separatist movement, which obviously was denounced by every other party leader. And with not much else to say, let's get into the results of this election, where there were a total of 282 seats in the House of Commons and 142 seats needed for a majority. 75.7% of Canadians would turn out to vote in this election, and that gave the winner 136 seats, which also amounted to 4,111,606 votes, which amounts to 35.89% of the popular vote, which was less than his opponent got. The winner of this election would be Joe Clark, the youngest prime minister to ever serve. However, Clark's minority government was dissolved just 9 months later, which led to another federal election being scheduled. And I'll see you guys for that election in 1980. Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 32nd election in Canadian history happened on the 18th of February 1980, but in one electoral district in Frontenac, this election actually took place on the 24th of March due to the death of the Social Credit Party leader Nelson Lassard. Speaking of these party leaders, the incumbent Prime Minister, Joe Clark, of the Progressive Conservative Party, has been leader since the 22nd of February 1976, who decided, I'm going to run in Yellowhead. That's obviously not what he decided, but that's what he stuck with. The former Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau of the Liberal Party, has been leader since the Prime Minister before Trudeau, Lester B. Pearson, resigned on the 6th of April 1968. He's running from Mount Royal. The New Democratic Party is nominating Ed Broadbent, who's been the leader since the 7th of July 1975, whose leader's seat is in Oshawa. And that Social Credit Party will be running Fabian Roy, the incumbent Social Credit Party leader, since the 30th of March 1979, who's running from Beauce. Clark was understandably under fire because of his perceived inexperience. For example, in its handling of the 1979 election campaign, he was planning on moving the embassy of Canada in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But obviously that didn't happen. Clark had maintained uneasy relations with the Social Credit Party when he needed the conservative populist Quebec-based party's 6 votes to get the legislation passed. He was unwilling to agree to the conditions they imposed for their support, though. Clark had managed to recruit one Social Credit MP, Richard Janel, to the PC caucus. Clark's Minister of Finance, John Crosbie, introduced an austere government budget in late 1979 that proposed to increase the excise tax on gasoline from 4 cents a liter to reduce the federal government's deficit. The NDP's finance critic, Bob Rae, proposed a subdiment to the budget's motion, stating that the House of Commons did not approve of the budget. Clark and the Progressive Conservatives campaigned on the slogan, "Real change deserves a fair chance." But the voters were not willing to give Clark this quote-unquote fair chance. Did they reflect it in the polls? Well, 69.3% of people voted in this election, 6.4% less than the last one. The winner of this election would get 4,855,425 votes, also known as 44.34% of the popular vote, winning 147, which is good enough to get a majority. This would be former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Joe Clark tanked, losing 33 seats overall in the House of Commons, which is actually the same amount that Trudeau gained. The same amount that NDP leader Ed Broadbent gained was also the same amount that Fabian Roy won, which was 0. And I'll see you guys for the election of 1984. Dazod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 33rd election in Canadian history happened on the 4th of September 1984, where the incumbent Prime Minister John Turner had scheduled an election. Wait a minute, John Turner? I'm fairly certain that I watched the last video and it clearly said Pierre Elliott Trudeau won. Well, earlier in the year, Trudeau retired from politics after making some very controversial patronage appointments. The Progressive Conservative leader, Brian Mulroney, who's been leader since the 11th of June 1983, running from the seat of Manicouagan, really stuck it to John Turner for appointing 70 more patronage appointments in his 2-year stint in office. Here's what Mulroney had to say during the debate.
And people a deep apology for having indulged in that kind of practice with those kinds of appointments.
Well, I've told you and told the Canadian people, Mr. Mulroney, that I had no option.
Well,
Chairman, your next question.
You had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it. This is wrong for Canada, and I am not going to ask Canadians to pay the price. You had an option, sir, to say no, and you chose to say yes to the old attitudes and the old stories of the Liberal Party. That, sir, if I may say respectfully, that is not good enough for Canadians.
I had no option. I was able
that
to
is an avowal of failure. That is a confession of non-leadership, and this country needs leadership. You had an option, sir. You could have done better.
John Turner really thought that he was smart by scheduling this election because he didn't necessarily have to schedule this election until 1985. The reason why he did schedule this election this year was because the Liberals were leading in the polls. He must have thought he was so smart. What he didn't realize was Queen Elizabeth II and Pope John Paul II were coming to Canada that year. And many people didn't even know John Turner, despite Canada's Kennedy and the finance minister under Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Many people still didn't recognize his name. If he had toured with Queen Elizabeth II and Pope John Paul II, recognizability could probably be very high for John Turner and may have ended up him winning this election. Turner's unpopularity, who has been a leader since the 16th of June 1984 and running from Vancouver Quadra, really helped the NDP party candidate Ed Broadbent, who's been the leader since the 7th of July 1975, running from Oshawa, because NDP has been historically known to be to the left of the Liberal Party, which is why many predicted that Turner's party would fall behind the NDP's. Did that happen? When 75.3% people turned out to vote, it determined that the winner would win the largest amount of seats ever to this day in Canadian history, 211, winning 6,278,818 votes, and 50.03%, the winner would be John Turner. Yeah, I'm just kidding with you. The winner was Brian Mulroney, who had the largest majority in Canadian history and still does hold that record to this day. This marked only the second time that the Progressive Conservatives would be in power since 1963, 21 years ago. Only a 9-month brief period when Joe Clark was head of government would that streak be broken by the Liberals. Absolutely insane stuff. And you have an option, sir, to see me in the next election of 1988. The Zod 500 presents Canadian Elections of History. The 34th election in Canadian history happened on the 21st of November, 1988, where just a couple of months prior, Brian Mulroney, the incumbent Prime Minister and the Progressive Conservative leader since the 11th of June 1983, who's running from Charlevoix, signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, which gave free trade between us and the United States. John Turner, the Liberal leader and also former Prime Minister, who's been the Liberal leader since the 16th of June 1984, who's running from Vancouver Quadra, said this about Mulroney in the debate.
Admire your father for what he did. My grandfather moved into British Columbia. My mother was a miner's daughter there. We're just as Canadian as you are, Mr. Mulroney, but I'll tell you this. You mentioned 120 years of history. We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years, we've done it. With one signature of a pen. You've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States, and will reduce us, I'm sure, to a colony of the United States, because when the economic levers go, the political independence is sure to follow.
Mr. Turner, with a document that's cancelable on 6 months' notice, be serious.
Look.
Be serious.
Cancelable. You're talking about our relationship with the United States. Once that
commercial document that's cancelable on 6 months' notice.
Commercial document.
That
document relates to
treaty.
It relates to every facet of our life. It's far more important to us than it is to the United States, sir. Far more important.
Please be serious.
Well, I am serious, and I've never been more serious in my life.
Please.
Gentlemen, we'll move on.
The Liberals' campaign was nothing short of awful. Notably, during one day in Montreal, 3 different costs were given for the proposed Liberal daycare program. When asked by reporters about the incident, Turner's chief of staff responded using vulgar language. And there was also a report in the back room to replace Turner as leader with Jean Chrétien, even though Turner had passed the leadership review in 1986, with 76.3% of delegates rejecting a leadership convention. And even by 1986, the Liberal Party was in severe debt because of their expenses of the national organization continuing to rise. Turner's office experienced significant staff turnover, and leaving members were willing to recount stories of the office's dysfunction to the press, resulting in Turner's leadership being nicknamed the Reign of Error. Despite this, Turner was polling pretty high because he was strongly campaigning against free trade, arguing that it would cost many Canadian jobs. That last debate that I showed you boosted him to 6 points ahead of Mulroney in the polls. Did it actually turn out? In the House of Commons, there was a total of 295 seats, also knowing that 148 seats were needed for a majority. 75.3% turned out to vote, which was the exact same from the previous election, and the winner would get 169 seats, a pretty big majority. With 5,667,543 votes and 43.02% of the popular vote, that would be Mr. Brian Mulroney, who continued to be Prime Minister. Tragically, one of the Conservative MPs for Beeve River, Mr. John Damer, who died 5 days after the election, which was not good enough to be sworn in. So they had a by-election, which is an election that is held for one seat when the member of parliament dies or resigns, which Brian Mulroney lost. So the majority went down to 168. Although Brian Mulroney was the first prime minister that was a conservative since Sir John A. Macdonald to win multiple majorities. And I'll see you guys for the election of 1993.